12:15 p.m. Eastern here on C-SPAN 2. Now, young Muslim leaders talk about perceptions of Islam in the media, and later, an update on today's Senate-Iraq debate.
What dominates news today is conflict and extremism on both sides. And rarely do we hear from those trying to make a positive difference. Tonight, we are fortunate enough to have with us those who are taking pragmatic steps towards reconciliation and understanding. We are proud to present these voices. Hello. My name is Sharon Goldman. I am the program director for the Bronfman Center for Jewish Life, and on behalf of the 92nd Street Y, I welcome you to this evening's program, Young Muslim Leaders, Their Voices, Their Vision, Their Hopes. And to help navigate us through these unfortunately not often enough chartered waters is our moderator, Ari Alexander. Ari Alexander is the co-founder and co-executive director of Children of Abraham, an international organization dedicated to the promotion of dialogue between Jewish and Muslim teenagers around the world. Ari has spoken at numerous international conferences about Children of Abraham, including in South Korea, Spain, Senegal, Belgium, Morocco, and Tunisia. He completed 2 master's degrees in the UK as a Marshall Scholar. He has a master's in comparative ethnic conflict from the Queen's University of Belfast and a master's in philosophy and modern Middle Eastern studies from the University of Oxford. His research led him to spending time in Beirut, Damascus, and Jerusalem. He has also served as a counselor and facilitator at 2 conflict resolution camps, Seeds of Peace International and Face-to-Face, Faith-to-Faith. In addition to working with teenagers in USY and at the Lauder camp in Hungary. Please note there are note cards when you came into the room on all of your chairs. We encourage all of you to please use those note cards to write your questions, which the ushers will be collecting towards the end of the program, and we will be asking some of your questions at the end. Also, our program tonight is being recorded by C-SPAN for broadcast, so as always, please take this very moment to please turn off your cell phones and any other noise-making devices. And now, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a very, very warm welcome to Ari Alexander. Thank you very much.
Thank you all very much for being here, especially on an evening when John Kerry and Charlie Rose are next door. It means a lot to all of us that you will share this next hour and a half with us. We'll see, depending on your questions. Growing up in the tight-knit Jewish community of Providence, Rhode Island, I was not exposed to any Muslim voices. The first time I remember hearing about Islam was to identify the religion of the seemingly violent people on television whose spokespeople declared their desire to kill Jews in Israel and perhaps elsewhere. Islam entered the living rooms of most Americans only with the horrors of 9/11. Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations became widely discussed. News anchors and leading pundits raised the possibility that Islam was fundamentally violent, colliding with the dominant values of Western civilization. Spokespeople for Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and Hamas were frequently given airtime. Many Americans began to cry out, "Where are the moderate Muslims?" who publicly and unequivocally denounce terrorism. Are they just not on TV? Or do they simply not exist? Since many of us did not have Muslim friends who could counter or contextualize the onslaught on Islam post 9/11, we were, by and large, at the mercy of our major media outlets to inform us. My uneasiness with a growing prejudice towards Islam rooted in my lack of interaction with Muslims, led me to Beirut and Damascus as a graduate student. Being immersed in Muslim societies proved to be transformative. The interconnectedness I felt with all human beings, in the abstract, had excluded the Muslim world, until I was there to make the connections myself. The process of my own personal encounter with Muslim societies led me directly to the work I do today to foster interactions between Muslim and Jewish youth around the globe. Since we began Children of Abraham in November of 2004, I have had the opportunity to interact with countless Muslim community leaders, imams, journalists, diplomats, and academics. They shine light on what can sometimes feel like a terrifying darkness. These colleagues provide a very different image of Islam than the one that came to me through CNN, the BBC, and the New York Times. I assembled this panel of courageous young Muslim leaders who I've had the pleasure to meet over the past 2 years. My motivation here is simple. I want you to hear their voices and to be exposed to their ideas and their actions. In my judgment, they are all driven by the very same concept of tikkun olam, repairing the world, that was taught to me in my Jewish upbringing. Let me now briefly introduce these extraordinary people. On my right, Fadi Elsalameen was born and raised in Hebron in the West Bank. He founded and co-directs Voice of Arab Youth, an organization whose aim it is to train Arab youth in micro-enterprise and entrepreneurship skills in order to foster income-generating jobs and educational projects in their home countries. Fadi has also been involved in facilitating relations between international investors and the Palestinian Authority. He has delivered countless speeches in the presence of world leaders, including Bill Clinton, Colin Powell, Kofi Annan, and the Dalai Lama. Most recently, Fadi led a panel with Nobel Peace Prize winner Betty Williams on the effects of war on children, and was asked by former President Clinton to participate in the Clinton Global Initiative. On his right, Professor Amaney Jamal is an assistant professor of politics at Princeton University. Her current research focuses on democratization and the politics of civic engagement in the Arab world. She extends her research to the study of Muslim and Arab Americans, examining the pathways that structure their patterns of civic engagement in the U.S. Jamal has written 2 books, both forthcoming in 2007. The first book, Barriers to Democracy, explores the role of civic associations in promoting democratic effects in the Middle East. Her second book, an edited volume with Nadine Naber, University of Michigan, looks at the patterns and influences of Arab American racialization processes. She is writing a third book on the politics of Islam and citizenship in the Arab world. Jamal is a Carnegie Scholar and serves as senior advisor on the Pew Research Center project on Islam in America. To her right, Rukh Rahman grew up in Pakistan at the time of the Afghan-Soviet War. This led Gul to volunteer her time and resources with different NGOs that were working for Afghan refugees. She has been a freelance journalist for many South Asian and Arab media outlets, writing about human rights, refugees, and other social, cultural, and economic issues. Gul is a trained software engineer who worked in Silicon Valley before coming to New York to join me as co-executive director of Children of Abraham. To her right, Eboo Patel is the founder and executive director of the Interfaith Youth Corps, a Chicago-based international NGO building the interfaith youth movement. He has a doctorate in the sociology of religion from Oxford University, where he studied on a Rhodes Scholarship. Eboo is the author of Acts of Faith, an online panelist for the Washington Post Newsweek magazine's On Faith blog, and an Ashoka Fellow, part of a select network of social entrepreneurs with ideas that are changing the world. And lastly, but certainly not least, on his right, Daanish Masood is currently executive coordinator at the Asma Society, an interfaith bridge-building nonprofit. After 9/11, Daanish worked as outreach coordinator for the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, where he focused on community organizing in New York's Arab and South Asian immigrant communities. Over the last 18 months, Daanish has been dedicated to developing programs to foster the emergence of an empowered leadership that speaks with a humane and credible voice in both Muslim minority and Muslim majority countries. Let's have a hand for our panelists who joined us tonight. To begin, I have asked our panelists to speak to us for approximately 5 minutes with the following directive. Our panelists have been asked to situate themselves in this conversation. In their opening comments, they will each discuss their Muslim identity and how their belief in coexistence and pluralism translate into practice in the work they do. They will also address whether or not they see themselves as representatives of a silent or perhaps quiet majority. The first to speak will be Fadi Elsalameen.
Good evening. Thank you, Ari, for the invitation. I'm very honored and very glad that I get this chance to talk to you about my faith, something I don't really talk about that much, even to myself sometimes, or to my own family. But I want to make one thing clear before I say anything. I'm not an expert on Islam or Islamic faith. What I can offer you really are the experiences that I have lived, the experiences of my friends, and maybe perhaps we can all reflect on them as a group. I was born and raised in Hebron. I'm the oldest of 9 children, and you could probably imagine a house with 9 children, probably all day, noisy, very, very busy. And I just want to mention a very small story which will tell you a little bit about the minds of young people in my part of the world. One of my brothers is named Obaida, and Obaida is literally the most annoying kid you'll ever meet in your life. And every day around 7 o'clock my family gathers to kind of watch the night news. And Obaida was making noise, and my brother Tariq was telling him to basically be quiet. And then all of a sudden, he refused to be quiet, and all of a sudden he heard the name Obaida on the news. So he stopped and said, why is my name being mentioned on TV? And my brother thought this was the perfect time to shut him up. Said, oh, it's nothing. It's just that the Israeli soldiers are collecting everybody with the name Obaida. So it will be a couple of minutes before they get to you. And, he went with a grin and continued to watch the news. And then all of a sudden, my brother started crying. He went to my mom, hysterical. He said, I want to change my name. I have to change my name. And she said, why? She's hugging him. She's holding him. She said, why do you need to change your name? He said, look, the Israeli soldiers are coming to get me. I have to change my name. She said, okay, at the end, gave in. She said, what do you want you to change your name to? And I think this was the funniest part. He said, I wanted to be either Sharon or Bush, one of the two. It's very funny to me, too. Actually, afterwards, I spoke with a friend of mine who was an American psychiatrist at Harvard, and I said, what can I make of this? What do you think is happening to my brother? And he said, this is probably something that is not only happening to your brother, but to a lot of people in situations like him. He's 7 years old, yet he does not feel safe or secure. In his mind, the 2 most strongest people in the world are Sharon and Bush, and he feels the only way he can be safe is if he's like them. So I was relieved. But that was the explanation, and the sad truth is this is really something that is happening not only to my brother. I don't know if you read today in the New York Times, there was an article precisely saying that Palestinian youth today are more prone toward violence. They are, compared to previous generations, they are angrier. They are, even among each other, to their own brothers, to their own family, their whole attitude is completely different. They are very, their aspirations to the future are completely different from generations previous to them. Now, about just something in general about what really, what are the reasons behind the gap that I see between the Muslims and the West in general. And again, these are not from the point of view of an expert. These are conversations that I've had with friends. And I think one of the main points that we've talked about, that I've talked about with my friends, were that, and they felt so eager to get across to an audience like yourself, is that the issue is not Islam. Islam is not a violent religion, and violence is not a characteristic of neither the Arab or the Muslim world. We admittedly have violent individuals, just like any other nation or people. And the extremists among us have agendas and methods that I feel are amplified by two main and very important points. One is the lack of economic opportunities, and two, the lack of political freedoms. Which brings me to my second point. There's a book, a very good book, that I recommend to all of you, is by a guy named Amartya Sen. It's called Development as Freedom. And in it he says that for any people to positively contribute to society, they have to have at least 5 things: political liberties, economic opportunities, social powers, basic education, and one which I think is extremely important is the encouragement and cultivation of initiatives. And then when you look at my part of the world, and when you see that at least, if not most of the above, if not all of them, at least most of them are missing, then I think it is fair to say that it should come as no surprise that the only environment that is thriving is that of desperation and fundamentalism. And I'll mention a small story. I have been very fortunate to be part of a camp called Seeds of Peace. As I said, I was born and raised in Hebron, and I grew up seeing Israelis only as soldiers and as settlers. I was the kid who would go to school, come back, drop his bag, and go throw rocks at the Israelis, and then that was basically my daily life. And then I had the chance to participate in Seeds of Peace in '98, and I came and I was able to get an education because of Seeds of Peace. And 3 years into the experience, I was able to get a college education at Erlam. After that, I was able to go home for the first time. And I looked around me and I saw that this was right after the first Intifada started. I looked around me and I saw that the expressions on people's faces were those of anger and frustration. There was really nothing for people to hold on. And my 3 closest friends, Jawdat, Muhammad, and Jabir, I looked at them, I had almost everything. I felt extremely selfish that I had all these opportunities and they had nothing. And I said, maybe it's better that I don't go back, that I actually stay with you. And they said something to me that will stay with me for the rest of my life. They said, Fadi, you have a choice, but we don't. And your choice today will be ours tomorrow. Unfortunately, tomorrow never came for them. Muhammad was 18 years old when he was promised a scholarship to join the preventative forces. And at the age of 18, he was killed by an Israeli rocket. He was part of the Palestinian security forces. So he never saw a scholarship. He never was able to finish his education. And Jawdat is another friend of mine who was arrested actually right before the last semester, where he would graduate from Hebron University. And he's still in jail, so he lost his dreams. And the last person is Jabber, who is, to me, is like, although he's the same age, but he is wise beyond years. Every time I sit next to him and he's either sipping tea or just talking in general, the conversation usually goes something like this: you are very lucky that you are studying in the United States. Look at me, or sitting in his room. I have posters of Arafat, Sheikh Yassin, and it was around the World Cup time, so he said, and Ronaldo. These are the people I'm stuck with for the rest of my life. And to a certain point, he's right. And I mention these stories not to be melodramatic, but to kind of reflect and offer a reflection about the opportunities that are really available for the young people in my part of the world. One last point that I think kind of contributes to a big gap between the Muslim world and the West is the issue of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. You go almost anywhere from Morocco to anywhere in the Muslim world, people will tell you that every time they watch the news and they see Palestinians being humiliated, that gets to them. I'll give you a small story, and the most difficult part for me is that these are people that are they are making up their own thoughts, they are making up their own assumptions, they are making up their own image of Jews, of Israelis, not because they were given the chance to meet them, but because of what they've heard, because of what they see. And that's why I feel very frustrated, and I feel a minority in this way, that I have actually had the chance. I'm here, I can call at least 10 people who are Jews, who are friends of mine, who have actually helped me come to this country. One of them who's a mother to me, and her name is Bobby Gottschalk. She co-founded Seeds of Peace. What I want to do, and what I want to ask from you, is to actually pay attention to these kind of programs, to pay attention to initiatives like these. It's very easy to ignore them. It's very easy to fall in the trap of accepting apologies from people. It's very easy. For me, the most ridiculous thing that I refuse to accept is that every day we hear apologies from our leaders. We are sorry that this is happening. If I knew that apologies would bring back my friends, if I knew apologies alone would help, I would scream as loud as I could. And I would say, I am sorry. I am sorry for bringing down the name of humanity to such level. I think we all need to ask for forgiveness for all of the injustice we have done to each other. One final point is that one thing we all have in common. It's our humanity. If we remember it, we win and prosper. And if we forget it, we lose and suffer. Again, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Fadi. The next to speak will be Professor Amaney Jamal.
Thank you so much, Ari. Thank you so much for having us here this evening. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. So to try to answer my question about how my work relates to my larger goals in life, if you may, I'll try not to bore you and be brief. But first of all, I want to say this is probably one of the first panels I've been on where I've been called part of a youth or the young Muslim leader. So I want to thank you for that as well. My kids don't think of me as that young, so they'll be delighted to hear that. ever since I was a young child, I've always enjoyed interacting with people, being around people, learning from other people, and trying to discourse and dialogue with people. So from a very young age, I knew I wanted to be a teacher. And I knew I wanted to try to change people's lives for the better, be a positive role model, carry that burden on my shoulders, where hopefully people could look up to me and not, and not think like, and think that after meeting me, they had a positive interaction rather than a negative interaction. So that was my goal as I was growing up as a young Muslim Arab woman in the Middle East. I wasn't always strictly observant Muslim, but once I was born in the United States. I lived then in Ramallah during my teen years, and then I came back to attend college here in the United States, and that's where I found Islam, and I embraced Islam as a Muslim. Although I was always Muslim, I wasn't necessarily practicing, and I'd be more than happy to talk about my journey, my faith journey, if you may, during question and answer. But I want to talk about then what did it mean to be a Muslim growing up in this country or trying to become a professional, and how that increased my passion for what I do. In the early 1990s, as I was still an undergraduate, there was a lot of optimism around the subject of Palestine and peace because the Oslo Accords had taken off. And for those of us who were young and passionate about the issue, Oslo really opened up a lot of doors and opportunities, and in a sense it was a dream come true. Finally, no matter what's going to happen, there was going to be a two-state solution. There would be reconciliation. We began hearing about children in Jerusalem, Arab and Israeli, playing with one another. So there was a lot of euphoria and optimism. Even when it became clear by 96, 97 that things weren't really progressing, we still were convinced that it was going to result in a two-state solution. There would be no way that the international world order, that the leaderships on both sides would drag two people back to hatred, war, and disruption where we were. So putting that aside, right, okay, I was wrong, but putting that aside, that means as an undergraduate student, as a person trying to finish up my studies and figure out what I was going to do with my life, I was really enjoying the art of education, learning, interacting, engaging one another, teaching people about the basics of Islam, not through the prism of convincing people that my religion wasn't violent, or not through the prism of convincing people that my relatives were not terrorists, etc., as has become the pattern since. So by the time I finished my graduate studies around 2002, two things had happened. Oslo had fallen apart. The reoccupation of all Palestinian territory. In the media here, it was completely covered as the Palestinians had a nefarious ultimate agenda, which was really to annihilate Israel through the guise of peace, and therefore the Palestinians can never be trusted. There's no somebody to work with on the other side, etc., because the media in this country tends to be extremely biased, and the popular media specifically tends to misrepresent what's happening on the ground. So that's the first thing, and then 9/11 happened. So those are two incidents, 2000, 2001, that were devastating, I think, to all Muslim Americans, to all Arab Americans, to all people who had been working towards this idea of reconciliation, because all of a sudden it was no longer, it could no longer be the objective just to talk and preach to one another and to appreciate the humanity that we share. All of a sudden, everybody, the Muslim community is on the defense. All of a sudden, we're claiming that we're moderate. We're claiming that we're human. We're claiming that we knew nothing about 9/11. We're claiming had we known anything about 9/11, we would have certainly told somebody about it. We were a community on the defense. At the same time, we're a community where the popular media is spinning ridiculous tales about the community. So in my opinion, things are, even today, as we're invited here to talk and to present ourselves, things are much worse today when we look at where we were in 1999 and 2000. Even if we look at the mainstream American public opinion, After 9/11, Americans were asked, non-Muslim Americans were asked, do you have favorable opinions about Islam and Muslims? A third of the American population said no. Straightforward. Today that number is close to 60%, right? So that since 9/11, the trend has worsened. For me as a Muslim, this is very concerning. One, I mean, just to personalize the issue, this is not good for me or my family. A. But B, but this means that all the efforts, all the money, all the attempts at interfaith dialogue, all the time that I've been taking out of publishing, which is, as an academic, something that we have to do, to try to communicate with people, to me, it's like we're fighting this upward battle, but we're getting nowhere. The tide has turned against us. Certainly the geostrategic realities in the world today, us being in Iraq, the continuing violence in Palestine, Israel, etc., this hasn't helped the case. So now, as a Muslim, I mean, my goals are, and as a scholar and as an academic, I mean, my passion for my work and what I need to do is basically continue teaching and educating, but also making sure that the ideals that unite us all, not just in the cliche format, but the ideals that really unite us all, whether they're the democratic principles, whether they're principles of humanity, also remain as the key issues that mediate our interactions with one another. So that's been a very hard challenge in this post-9/11 era. And I'd be more than happy to take questions and question and answer. One of the questions that Ari did ask us, and I only have about 2 minutes, or 1 minute, 1 to 2 minutes, well, 1 minute, okay, is that, am I representative of a silent majority? Am I representative of a silent or vocal minority? I don't think this whole notion of representativeness bothers me. Because the fact of the matter is that the question that's been posed is, where are the moderate Muslims? And if you listen to this question over and over and over, it really becomes numbing. Because what is a moderate Muslim? Does that mean I'm a moderate Muslim? Why? Because I speak English? Because I'm educated? Because I have connections to the West? Because I value human life? What does that mean about my children? What does that mean about my siblings, my friends, my community, my society? What does it say about me? Because as a Muslim, how can I identify with a religion and be part of a religion and embrace its symbols when it's it's quote unquote not moderate? And when we use the word moderate, what does that mean? The opposite of moderate is what the post-9/11 environment says. So that's why this terminology is extremely bothersome. And I'd be more than happy to clarify how I feel about it in the question and answer session. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Amaney Jamal. The next to speak will be Rukh Rahman.
Thank you, Ari. Good evening. It is such a pleasure to be here. I'm honored that I have been given this opportunity to talk about something that is very close to my heart, but I try not to talk about it too much. To begin with, when Ari told me about this panel, I was very reluctant. I didn't want to be part of the panel for the only reason, not because I didn't want to talk to the Jews or come to a Jewish foundation or a community center, but because I don't want to be seen as representative of over 1 billion people. Just like the radicals and the violent people don't speak for us, similarly, I don't think that I, in my opinion, or anyone could also speak for 1.2 billion or some people. The question was, who am I and where is my Muslim identity and where do I stand in the conversation with Islam, and how has it affected in terms of what I do in my professional life? And the answer to that is, it's a complex story. It's a personal journey from relearning my own faith. It's a journey where I learned I embraced Islam when I came to the United States. I was born in a Muslim family, but very secular, very liberal. So when I started wearing the hijab, I think my father almost fainted. He could not realize that one of his kids would choose while living in the States to wear the hijab. To me, it was about my own identity or about what was happening post 9/11. And I wanted to not only to prove to myself, but also prove to the world that not everyone or anyone who looks like me, who wears the hijab, who sports a beard, is a terrorist or is a radical or is a fundamentalist. Growing up amidst the Afghan-USSR war with millions of refugees, the exposure to arms and armed conflict and its effect on community were drilled into me from a very, very young age. So as horrible as 9/11 was, it didn't shake me up the way it shook a lot of people. Why? Because as a teenager, I have seen people blow up in front of my eyes. Okay, I apologize. I'm not feeling too good, so I'm a little bit shaky. Thank you. So the idea of the powerful and the powerless, the sense of being under siege, the ideology of jihad, and its interpretations and much, much more were always part of my identity while I was in certain ways they still are. The context is a little bit different, but looking around myself, I still see parallels of being under siege. Today, as I look at Islam and as I am represented in the media or in the Western world, it is extremely hard on one's self to be seen and portrayed as a radical right-wing fundamentalist. And the fact of the matter is that my journey towards and into my own religion has actually taught me the virtue of the respect of others, whether they are the Jews, the Christians, the people of the book or not, just in terms of the human life. The value of human life was drilled into me the more I went into and I've sought what Islam was all about. Today I would just like to touch upon what in my mind is the biggest problem and the biggest hindrance in the work I do, and that is the portrayal or the dehumanization of the Muslims. We are portrayed as bloodthirsty barbarians, burning buildings and around the world and ready to kill and burn. And we are also perceived as those who hate the freedoms of the West. But when these images are shown or these things are discussed, there is never a political, social, or religious context given. And the lack of Muslim voices in those conversations is a large part of why we are perceived as we are perceived. Secondly, I also feel that when we are criticized that where are the Muslims, why are they not talking, where are the moderates? What is a moderate Muslim? Do I recognize myself as a moderate Muslim? No, I am not a moderate Muslim. I'm a practicing conservative traditional Muslim. And when people say to me, are you moderate? To me, what moderate means is those who are radically critical of Islam, those Muslims who are radically critical of Islam and who toe the pro-Western line. And I do not associate with them. They don't represent me. They are not part of my existence. So at times when the question of moderate Muslims come up, I never perceive it as an honor. Sometimes it becomes more like an insult. One of the problems that I see, and since I worked as a journalist, so I look at the media and how it operates or it works, what I see is that the Muslim voices are not only not shown on TV, but the people who condemn terrorism. For example, the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar Mosque in Egypt condemned 9/11 and any attack on civilian population, but how many of us actually knew about that or read that? Thomas Friedman has links on his website to all the Muslim leaders or imams who have spoken against terrorism or attacks on human civilian life, but the mainstream media never picks it up. One of the other frustrations that I have is the West's attitude towards dialogue. To me, it's like we are going to have a dialogue, but we are going to have it on our own terms. We will pick the Muslims who we think we should have a dialogue with. We are not given a choice to choose people who we would like in a way to represent us. So it goes back to the idea of the powerless and the powerful. And by and large, it is the powerful who gives us the definitions. And those definitions are used against the powerless. So at this point in time, Western civilization has an immense amount of sovereignty on the planet. And they have already framed this discourse. And all of us are often stuck in reacting to already framed discourse and not allowing our own terms and definitions to come into play. So we have to keep going back and keep redefining ourselves. I'm not a terrorist. I'm not an extremist. I'm not this. I'm not that. In the US and in the Western Europe particularly, I think they have failed to realize that Muslim identity or the religious identity in the Muslim world is far more important than racial identity. And here we cannot talk about race. We cannot be racist because it's looked down upon. But if we are going to go around beating Islam or people who practice this religion, it's okay. It's fair game. So that makes me question the sincerity of the leaders of these worlds when they say that they want to actually have a dialogue with the Muslim world or with the larger Islamic world. Because for me, I am first and foremost a believer. And if you denigrate my religious identity, you're doing something far more egregious to me than just attacking my race. You're taking away the whole core of my being. Ari asked me to answer a question of, how coexistence and pluralism translate into the work I do. And in a brief comment, I think I would say that when I read the Quran for the first time, really understood what it meant, it made me realize how important it is to work with the people or work for the people, regardless of age, race, gender, religion. And to me, I represent to the best of my ability my religion. How I act with people, how I lead my daily life. To me, I am a representative in a very small manner of a religion that is under siege right now. And one of the things that upsets me the most is the West celebrates those who either ridicule Islam or who are hostile towards it. So if something is written against Islam or the Quran or the Prophet, for example, that is celebrated in the name of freedom of speech, regardless of the fact that 1 billion or so people do not see it as freedom of speech. They see it as an insult to their own religion or to their own being. I think I would like to just end with a very interesting Arabic poem which translates as, "We are living in the age of such extreme that the one who is not driven mad by it is not sane." Thank you.
Thank you, Gul. Gul's been really under the weather for the last 2 days, so we really especially appreciate her being with us tonight. Next to speak will be Eboo Patel.
Glad to be here tonight. Thank you so much, Ari, for inviting me, and thanks for coming, everybody. My name is Eboo Patel. I lead an organization in Chicago called the Interfaith Youth Corps. The Interfaith Youth Corps' big idea is that young people from different religious backgrounds should be coming together in ways that build understanding and that serve the common good. And we accomplish this through a broad range of programs, but also in large part through trying to change the discourse about matters that count in the 21st century. It reminds me a little bit of what W.E.B. Du Bois famously said 100 years ago, that the problem of the 20th century is going to be the problem of the color line. And we are light years away from fully solving the problem of the color line. And still it seems that the dawn of the 21st century, the problem of the next 100 years or so, is going to be the problem of the faith line. Every day in the news we read about people from different religious communities killing each other in the name of God. But I don't think the faith line divides Muslims and Jews, or Christians and Buddhists, or Hindus and Zoroastrians. I think that the faith line divides religious totalitarians and religious pluralists. It divides people who think that there is only one legitimate way of being, believing, and belonging on earth, and are willing to do anything to condemn, to coerce, to cow, to kill other people unless they abide by that way of living. And on the other side of the faith line are people who are committed to the notion that those of different creeds and belonging to different communities need to live together in some sort of mutual trust and harmony. I actually think that the vast majority of the world is standing on the faith line. They incline towards pluralism because I think that's the natural inclination of the human condition, that we seek to want to live together. I think America is an example of that. I think that Islam is an example of that. I think that Judaism is an example of that. People want to be together in positive ways. I think the biggest challenge we face at the dawn of the 21st century is that the religious totalitarians are very clear about what they are about. Their articulation is cogent, and for those in particular situations, it is extremely compelling. Live this way, it is the only way to be pure, and everybody else is evil. And your job is to destroy that evil. I think that religious pluralists are less clear about what we are about. We are less compelling. We are less sharp in our articulation. And it took me some time to get to a point where I wanted to start an organization and disappoint my immigrant parents who were like, we came from India to America so you could do what? What's this NGO thing? What's wrong with MD? You know, fewer letters is good. And actually, I think for me, it started back in high school. The lunch table I sat at in high school included a Nigerian evangelical, a South Indian Hindu, a Cuban Jew, a Lutheran, a Catholic, and a Mormon of various Euro-American stock. And everybody was kind of religious to a degree. And we knew that because somebody would say every once in a while, you know, I can't eat a certain kind of food for the next 30 days, or I can't eat a certain kind of food today, or I can't play basketball on Sunday because my mom is taking me to some prayer thing. But we never really pushed the conversation beyond that. I think there was a couple of reasons for it. Number one, we felt like religion was only private, that it was something we did away from other people. And number two, because we didn't know enough about our religions to share it with other people. Effectively, we only had a private language of faith, so to speak. We didn't have a bridging language, no way of articulating what it was that was important in our faith traditions to other people. So we lived this kind of bifurcated existence. And I thought that was just kind of the deal with religion. Until I got to college and I started paying more and more attention to the news. And I realized that every time I saw religion in the news, it was accompanied by the sound of a bomb or a gun. So in Bosnia, where tens of thousands of Muslims were being murdered in effectively an interreligious war in the early mid-1990s. In Israel-Palestine, where there was this ongoing conflict that during the time I was in college, had, as Professor Jamal mentioned, a brief moment of hope, which was destroyed when an Orthodox Jew murdered one of the great men of the late 20th century, Yitzhak Rabin. When a couple of years later, a white supremacist rampaged through the Midwest, shooting African Americans, Jews, and Asians, not far from where I live right now, and did it not only in the name of white supremacy, but also in the name of the Christian identity movement. So I'm watching television and I'm thinking to myself, why is it that every time I see religion, something which for me is something you're very quiet about, it's always accompanied by something very loud and destructive? And in college, I also got involved in a lot of social justice causes. And something occurred to me one day, that all the heroes of the movements that I admired in the 20th century were almost across the board people of faith. Mother Teresa, Dorothy Day, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Thich Nhat Hanh, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Marshall Meyer, Jane Addams, the list goes on and on and on. And what's striking is these people are all from different faiths. They're not all part of one religion. Somehow Judaism managed to produce heroes like Heschel and Marshall Meyer. Islam managed to produce heroes, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism. Right? So I'm watching religion on television only in a context of violence. And I'm reading in books on social justice about the possibility of religion producing an alternative narrative, an alternative reality in the world. And then it strikes me a powerful resonance between these two stories. Everybody on both sides is young. So in the Palestinian territories, the murderer of Yitzhak Rabin, Benjamin Smith, these are all people in their teens and 20s. And similarly, the religious heroes we all admire, although we often don't recognize it, were so young when they began their movements. So King was 26 years old in Montgomery, Alabama. Gandhi was even younger when he started his movement against racist pass laws in South Africa. The Dalai Lama even younger than that, when he moves his people out of occupied Tibet into India. Jane Addams in her late 20s when she starts Hull House. Dorothy Day in her early 30s when she founds the Catholic Worker Movement. On and on and on. So I'm thinking to myself, why is it that sometimes religious people become bombs and sometimes young religious people become bridges? What is it that makes the difference? And at this point, I'm starting to investigate and be more interested in my own faith, the faith of Islam. And I kind of get to it in a somewhat circuitous path, because my first interest when I become interested in religion is in Buddhism. And I have a mentor who happens to be a close associate of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And so my mentor, who's a Catholic monk, sends me to Hindu India to go meet with this Buddhist leader. And on the way, I stay with my grandmother for several weeks, which, frankly, I'm kind of apprehensive about, because this is the woman who would come to our house in the suburbs of Chicago when I was a kid, and I would try to sneak out the back before she was awake in the morning, because I knew she would grab me and say, "Are you saying your prayers? Are you going to marry a Muslim girl?" And I'm like, "Mama, I'm 9 years old, you know? Give it a break a little bit." And I didn't really understand or appreciate the depth or the purpose of her or her faith. But while I stayed with her in Bombay, something happened which dramatically changed my life. I woke up one morning and there was somebody new staying in my grandmother's home. And she didn't look like she was part of the family, and she didn't look like she was one of the household help. She was dressed in a torn white nightgown, several sizes too large for her. And I said, "Mama, who is this woman?" My grandmother said, "Well, I don't know her real name. The leader of the local prayer house brought her here. He said that her uncle and her father are abusing her. So we'll keep her safe for a few weeks, and then we'll send her off to a better place." And I said, "Mama, don't you think this is a little bit dangerous? Maybe even a little bit crazy? You can't just shelter women who are being abused in your home. I mean, it's kind of off the wall, don't you think?" My grandmother kind of fixed me in a gaze and said, "How old are you again?" And I said, 22. And she said, "I've been doing this for more than twice the amount of time you've been alive." And she kind of moved over to the cupboard and brought out this shoebox full of Polaroid pictures. And it was the pictures of all these women that over the past 45 or 50 years she had sheltered. women that she had saved from economic hardship, women that she had saved from abusive relationships, women who might have been mentally handicapped and their families had rejected them. My grandmother had taken them in, had helped them get an education, had helped them find husbands, had helped them travel to other places, and she would tell me all these women's stories. You know, this one owns a business in Hyderabad, this one is in a marriage in Calcutta, she's very happy, this one has 3 children, and she lives in Amritsar. And it was amazing to me. This is a dimension of my grandmother that I'd never known. And finally I said to her, why do you do this? She kind of shrugged her shoulders and said, because I'm a Muslim. This is what Muslims do. And that sat in my gut and in my heart all night and all the next day. And I kind of thought to myself, well, I'm a Muslim too. Right now, a Muslim who's largely interested in Buddhism, but I'm a Muslim too. And what am I doing? There's a great line by T.S. Eliot that we do not inherit traditions. We work to earn them. We work to live up to them. So what am I doing to live up to the term one who submits to the will of God? And as I reflected back in my high school experience of religious diversity without relationships between those religiously diverse young people, no religious conversation, nothing about who we were as people of faith between my Nigerian evangelical friend or my Cuban Jewish friend, my Indian Hindu friend, as I thought about all the young people that I saw killing one another in the name of God, and as I thought about the great movements of the 20th century led by young people of faith with such a powerful interfaith character, the image of King and Heschel marching together in Selma, the image of Gandhi and Bacha Khan reading alternately from the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita in Indian villages. I thought, what my experience is an experience of people trying to live together and totalitarians and extremists trying to stop that. So what I have to do with my life is try to build bridges in ways where that can withstand those who would try to bomb them. And I found the deepest kind of resources for this in the three traditions I belong to, in India, in America, and Islam. And I feel like much of my life has been spent with those 3 traditions battling within me. And I came to some sort of internal coherence with those traditions. It was because I found the common resonance of people trying to live together, and those traditions trying to be resources for people to live together. And I feel that it's most powerfully articulated in the Holy Quran for me. And I'll just leave you with 2 lines. One from Surah 49 of the Holy Quran, where God tells us that He made us different nations and tribes that we may come to know one another. And also where God tells the Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of God be upon him, in the Holy Quran, that God sent him to earth to be nothing but a special mercy upon all the worlds. Right? Not a mercy upon one nation or one tribe, but a special mercy upon all the worlds. And I saw my grandmother trying to live that, and inshallah, in some small way, we accomplished that at the Interfaith Youth Corps. Thank you.
Thank you, Eboo. And the last to speak will be Daanish Masood.
Good evening. Foremost, I want to thank Ari and the organizers for this wonderful opportunity. Thank you so much for having us. It's for honoring us by inviting us today. My name is Daanish Masood. I work for the ASMA Society, which stands for the American Society for Muslim Advancement Society. Clearly our organizer, or founder I should say, was going through a bout of dyslexia at the time when he came up with the name. Don't tell him I said that, because a lot of you know him. I have, how should I put it, a complicated history. I was born and raised in Saudi Arabia and have been living in New York for the last 9 years now. But I am not ethnically Arab. I come from an old Muslim family that has its origins close to the Nepali border in North India. And my family is half Shiite, half Sunni. Sorry, I think I gave all of you dyslexia there. Yes, as I mentioned, I was born and raised in Saudi Arabia. Being of South Asian descent in Saudi Arabia is somewhat problematic because of how South Asians are frequently treated. Now, I look at myself very differently from a lot of the vast majority of South Asians that live in Saudi Arabia are construction workers. And I see myself as very, very privileged being the son of a businessman. Yet at the same time, there are certain things that are institutionalized in Saudi labor law that prevent or that discriminate against us. For instance, they'll have a system of pay scales whereby for the same job, someone of South Asian descent will get paid less than someone who's ethnically Arab or someone who's American. So what that's done is that it's kind of fueled this desire for me to work towards having people that come from minorities or working for the disempowered, helping them gain entitlements in some form of equity. Of course, this is all compounded by my experience of being an immigrant in the United States and having been here in the last 9 years and having actually been kicked out of the United States once during those 9 years because of various paperwork issues. So as I mentioned, it's what all of that has done is that I have this strong desire to, work for people that come from disempowered groups. And of course, my own complicated kind of background has really made me think of identity and how I define identity. For myself, I define myself as an aggregate of my experiences. It's the only way that I can get my head around my background. And I guess that's what my belief in pluralism is rooted in, that all of us are so much more complicated and our experiences are so much more sophisticated than a simple label. All of this, of course, I should mention, I went to college at New York University, and I graduated with honors in philosophy, analytical philosophy, and Middle Eastern studies. Shortly after I graduated, and it was kind of a very tense post-9/11 environment, and I ended up working for the ADC. The ADC is the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, and we were doing mostly civil rights work because things were a mess. It was based in New York, and things were a mess in New York immediately after 9/11. As you can imagine, there was all sorts of job discrimination going on, all kinds of hate crimes. Of course, I should mention also special registration, and I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with special registration, but basically, if you belong to a Muslim majority country, any Muslim majority country, you had to go in and to your local FBI office and register with them periodically, and kind of tell them about your whereabouts, and they'd ask you all sorts of questions. Of course, when they first instituted the program, because they know that a lot of people that are from Muslim majority countries are here illegally, they said that they would not hold them against, they would not hold the fact that they were here illegally against them, but and that they should still come in to register with the FBI. But that promise was not kept. So I had a lot of work at my job, basically. I just want to talk a little bit about being a minority in the United States as Arabs, as Muslims, as South Asians, as all the groups, the multiple groups that comprise the Muslim population in the United States, that they say is about 7 million, though to some that's a contentious figure. Each group has gone through a difficult acceptance phase in this country. Of course, I can give you multiple examples. There, of course, Jews, Catholics, Italians, Latinos, and I think it's almost, most sociologists describe it as a process. And I don't know, I should ask Eboo about this. Eboo's the resident sociologist. And there's a long struggle, but there is a trajectory here. And I feel very much that we are on that trajectory. I mean, if you kind of study the development of the community, how it's going, what kind of institutions are being built, the kind of work that's going on, the kind of collaboration that's going on between various groups, you see that it's very similar to the trajectory that other minority populations have taken. The reason that this is important is because from one minority to another, I feel like there's a lot we have in common. And that's something that we don't talk about enough. I think that the Muslim community can learn a lot from the Jewish community in terms of the trajectory that the Jewish community has taken in the United States. And I think that's definitely a premise on which we need to build dialogue between our two communities. I want to talk very briefly because I'm going to say, I wanted to say make a number of points, but I do want to address the question that Ari asked. One of the questions Ari asked was my reaction to being called a moderate Muslim or the label of moderate Muslim. I personally react to it on multiple levels. For my immediate reaction, I mean, I am a bit, I do consider myself part of the intellectual elite, given the opportunities for education that I've had. A lesser intelligent member of the intellectual elite, of course. Is that my immediate reaction is that it's a barrier to dialogue sometimes. Because the idea is that if you are a moderate Muslim, you're very much the exception. That you're okay because you won't kill me, you're not violent, but I don't know about the rest of you. And to make that the departure point for dialogue, I think is problematic. But I think what's more damaging than that is the fact that it elides a lot of subgroups into one. It prevents us from understanding the situation on the ground. It prevents us from understanding, for instance, people talk about political Islam. People sometimes use it, political Islam interchangeably with fundamentalism. But talking about groups that can, espouse a political Islamic ideology, there are several groups. There's so many different variants. There are those that adopt a more they adopt non-violent strategies, while there are others that, of course, as you know, adopt very violent strategies. The point that I'm trying to make is that when you elide all these groups into one, you fail to see the gradations that exist on the ground in all these different countries and all these kind of locales. Yet at the same time, I mean, when I kind of get off my high horse, which I do sometimes, I realize that it does have some utility. Because at the end of the day, we're not, as people that consider themselves part of this kind of members in this kind of huge discourse, or interlocutors in this discourse of Islam, the West, relationships between different minority groups, on and on, we don't realize that we won't be able to reach the majority of people. We are a very small percentage. Those of you who attend events like this, those of us who speak at events like this, we're a very small group, a very tiny percentage relative to the population. And what a term like moderate Muslim does is that it allows others that don't belong to this tiny percentage of people that come to events like this, it allows them to understand that the entire religion and the entire, adherence of that religion, the entire group of those people is not violent. That there are those who are, other than what you see mostly in the media. Having said that, what I want to do, what I had hoped that someone else would take up, because I am by no means an expert on this matter, I want to talk very, very briefly about kind of the history of Islamic thought, Muslim thought, over the last 100 years. I mean, and Ari says I can do it in less than a minute. Well, very basically what's happened is that in some senses, people have reacted, the intelligentsia have reacted very defensively, because you have a situation where all these countries are coming out of being colonized. They've kicked out their colonizers. There have been anti-colonial movements. And at the same time, there's the advent of nationalism. This kind of very exclusivist nationalism, where these nationalist kind of stories or ideas and myths are being created in order to get people to buy into these ideas. And it's very exclusivist. And what all these kind of processes have done is that they've made people retreat. People aren't as self-critical as they could be or as they once were at the height of Islamic scholarship. So this is an important thing to remember when kind of talking about Islam, Muslims, and especially over the last 100 years. Now, in terms of the community here, I want to say that, again, going back to the point that I started with, which is the trajectory of the Muslim community in the United States, we're going through something very similar to what the Jewish community was going through. Now we're kind of beginning to build institutions that allow for multiple interpretations of the faith. And, for these different interpretations to flourish within one society. That's very important. For instance, it was in America that all these kind of different institutions of conservative Judaism or Reform Judaism developed. And in a sense, my own humble opinion, is that American Jewry kind of led world Jewry when it came to these things. What we're trying to do is something similar within the Muslim community. However, it's complicated by several factors, such as we live in an era where global communication is so widespread that, for instance, I'll give you a brief example. For instance, if a Muslim, generally mixed prayers are not led by women, in most Muslim communities anyway. So when a Muslim woman leads a mixed gender prayer, she gets death threats from Somalia. In America, a Muslim American woman leads prayer, a mixed gender prayer, and she starts getting death threats from Somalia, from various Yemen, different countries, all because everyone finds out about it. This puts different pressures on this community. And, of course, it's another barrier that we have to deal with. Now, finally, just a quick point. I just want to make 2 quick points very quickly. Okay? Amaney, I'd love to take questions, please. I've said a lot of stuff, and I want to say more things, as too much to Ari's displeasure. But I just want to say 2 quick things, which is that Amaney, I think, very rightly critiqued interfaith work and how it's not working, and how kind of these surveys are showing that people are becoming, are not developing favorable opinions of other minorities, or Muslims, I should say. And I very much agree with this. I mean, I work for an interfaith bridge-building organization. That's what I do. And we very much work with the elite. I mean, we very much work with this kind of Manhattanite crowd, like us, like you, who, are exposed to so much more. We're not really getting to the majority. And different people have different ideas. For instance, Robert Fisk, who's a British journalist, says that you need to start, going to gas stations on highways in the United States. I don't know if I'm up for doing that yet. But, that's one thing. But, at the same time, I think what we need to continue, that shouldn't stop us, is what I'm trying to say. We need to continue developing these relationships, these personal relationships, because they're very important. And I want to end with a quick cheesy story, which is always the best way to end. After 9/11, the day of 9/11, I was maybe 10, 12 blocks from the buildings, saw people covered in dust come out. It was a huge mess. And 15 minutes after the second plane crashed into the buildings, I heard all these people on the street saying things like, "I didn't know the Palestinians were this sophisticated." And, of course, I was like, oh, God. I mean, I knew it was going to be a big mess. So at my school, I was at NYU at the time, finishing up. I went to the Islamic Center to see if anyone was there, because we kind of knew that, things were going to get messy. And there I met an Orthodox Jewish friend of mine. He was standing inside the Islamic Center. There was no one else but him. His name, interestingly enough, is Jeddah, Israel. Jeddah is, interestingly enough, a city in Saudi Arabia, and Israel, well, you know what Israel is. So I said, "Jeddah, what are you doing here? Why are you here?" I mean, he said, He said, listen, this is maybe 20 minutes after the attacks happened. He said, listen, I know things are going to get messy now, and I know that girls that wear hijab, that veil, that cover their hair, are going to be targeted. So I wanted to come here to see if there's anyone who needs to go home because I can walk them home. And, you know, at minimum, if they see an Orthodox Jewish guy walking with her, they'll think twice before doing or saying something. And it's stories like this that kind of, you know, fuel my belief in continuing the work we do. And, of course, stories that Ari and Rukh and all of you tell me, and Eboo, of course, of the interfaith work they're doing. That's all. Thank you very much.
Can you hear me from this microphone? Thankfully, all the panelists equally disobeyed me, which is great because no one has to look foolish. You got to hear them all speak their mind and what they wanted to say, which I'm very happy with. I'm also very happy to ignore all the questions that I had prepared for about 45 minutes of questions and to go straight to the questions that the audience members have asked. So here we go. Anybody can answer any of these questions because no one has specified an individual, and feel free to pass, but try to make your comments as brief as possible so we can get through as many of their questions as possible. The first question is, who should speak on behalf of Islam? Daanish, do you want to take that?
Wasn't quietness a good response?
Well,
Wasn't the fact that everybody was quiet a good response?
well, I mean, this is a question that we constantly address. You're making me quite the talker today, Ari. One of the things that I do through my organization is we work with the disempowered majorities of the Muslim world, which are women and youth. And we develop strategies for them to build networks amongst each other and give them leadership skills. So it's kind of leadership development, but slightly more than that, because, of course, there's value in the network we're creating of leaders, of emerging leaders from all these Muslim minority and Muslim majority countries. This is international. This is done internationally, of course. But there's also value in the dialogue that we have, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. One of the things that we often talk about when we get this group together on an annual basis is who has the right to talk about Islam. And anyone who calls himself a Muslim has the right to talk about Islam. I mean, we can't, the airwaves have to be democratic. We can't, we can't demand that they not talk about Islam. At the same time, when it comes to attention from the media and the amplification of these messages in the media, we also try to work with media, both in America and in the Middle East. I mean, I'll give you an example. What ends up happening very much, as I'm sure all of you are aware, is that the sensationalist messages get broadcast. What gets broadcast is, people saying the most violent or the most horrible things on either side, on the Arab side, whether on Al Jazeera, for instance, and then we have our, of course, our beloved Fox News in the United States. In a recent meeting with Riz Khan is formerly of CNN and now working for Al Jazeera English. And our executive director was talking to him, and he was talking about how what people always talk about. There are no moderates. There's no moderate leadership. There's no one talking with an equitable and humane voice. And my executive director, Daisy Khan, said to him right away. She said, "Listen, you're not interested. Come to these events that we have. Come to our leadership development seminars where people are talking with a humane and equitable voice and amplify our messages. We invite you every time, but you don't show up." So I mean, it's a process of working with the media and amplifying these messages and getting these people who are interested in advancing their communities and do speak with a humane and an equitable voice and are interested in the pluralism that exists within the Muslim world, which I think I introduced you to through my background, and getting them to have these dialogues and then getting media to come.
Thank you. Eboo, do you want to address that question?
Just maybe very quickly, a couple of things. Number one, when Muslims say the media is biased, let me tell you what that means. It means that many of us know that there are a small segment of Muslims in the world who are invested in making Islam look violent. They want Islam to look violent. And they have found an exceptional medium for making it look so. They do things that draw the cameras, and the cameras come. Why do you think they videotape beheadings? So that Fox News will play them over and over and over again. And what does Fox News do? It plays the beheading over and over and over again. Why do you think they videotape the confessions of suicide bombers? So that Fox News will play the confession over and over and over again. So there is this industry in the world of Muslims who want Islam to look violent. And then there is this industry in the world of non-Muslims who want Islam to look violent. And reams of books and websites on how Islam is a hateful, violent religion. Right? I actually think that Osama bin Laden and Pat Robertson have a very similar line. It's true. Islam can produce nothing but violence. I wish the two of them would go into a room and have the conversation and leave me alone. Leave the rest of us alone.
Celebrity deathmatch.
There you go. Exactly. And what I think we need to find is what is the visual equivalent of September 11th for pluralism. September 11th was both heinous murder and a media ploy. It was both a way to horribly gut a nation and a world and to rip lives out of that world, and a way to get on television into eternity. What does the equivalent of that look like for pluralism? How do you picture what as the great Muslim poets Rumi and Shams said, if you're not building rooms where wisdom can be openly spoken, you're building a prison. How do you put that mansion on television? And that's a challenge for all of us, I think.
We're going to move on to the next question as we move down the panel. The next question is, are you all optimistic or pessimistic about the Islam versus the West question? Gould, do you want to begin?
I guess personally I would say that I am half and half. I'm optimistic yet pessimistic looking at the realities of our world right now. In my vision and my dream, I would like to see Islam being represented as a non-violent, all-encompassing religion, what it was supposed to be. But looking around us, looking at Iraq and Chechnya and Palestine and everywhere, wherever there is either occupation or war, I don't see that happening anytime soon. So part of my optimism is people like us who engage in dialogue work or who are trying to reach out to the youth so that the youth, the young people of today might be able to make a difference tomorrow.
Thank you. I suppose I'm neither pessimistic or optimistic about the whole Islam versus West issue because I really haven't seen the ongoing quote-unquote conflict as an Islam versus a West issue. I think there's enormous misunderstanding going on here in the West about Islam, one that has feeded into vulnerabilities, fears, anxieties, stereotypes, and so forth. I think in the Muslim world now, there's also a response to what's perceived as Western hostility towards their own religion, and similarly what's perceived here as Muslim hostility towards the West. But we're talking about people who probably have never interacted with one another, never seen one another, yet there's this whole hype and fear, and people are not sleeping at night thinking about, the Muslims are coming or the Westerners are coming. If we look at the type of conflicts we have in the region, they've never been about quote-unquote Islam per se. They've been about other issues, oil, regimes, stability, alliances, partnerships, and that's what's going to drive nuclear weapons. These are issues that have dominated conflict, and it's not about Islam per se. I do want to add one thing, though, about who speaks for Islam. Just my response is, it's who you want to listen to. And that's, as Muslims, that's what we do. And I think that's a good example. And unfortunately, the people that we're listening to here in the West are not your average people that appeal to the wide majority of Muslims? Thank you.
My question to Fadi is there a Muslim foreign policy?
If there is, I'm not aware. I'm not part of forming that foreign policy. I'm not sure what you mean by your question, but just two things that I want to mention very quick. One, I think religion in general is treatment, the way you treat people. As a Muslim, if I treat you well, you will go and relay that story to other people. And I think in that sense, you are also speaking for Islam without me having to go into everybody's house or community and talk about Islam. The same way you expect me to go back to my community and my family and talk about Judaism, talk about people in general, I think the least that we could expect of you is to do the same. And I think in that way it goes both ways. So.
Okay, we're going to finish with one more go-around, which I will combine an audience member's question with a question of my own that I'd like the panel to offer a brief comment on in closing. The question from the audience was, what steps do you personally take to better understand your neighbors and or the other? And you can either answer that directly or combine that with my question, which is, what is the most constructive role non-Muslims can play in supporting your work? Or put a little bit differently, what do you hope that the audience takes going forward from this evening? If everyone could try to limit their comments to about 1 minute, we will close.
Do you want me to answer Ari first, or anyone?
Why don't we start down here with Fadi?
Okay. I think one of the things I already mentioned was obviously the fact that you can take messages away from people like the panels today and relay them to people that you know. Another thing I think that the one question I always get whenever I go and visit my family in Palestine is the same exact question I get from people here when I'm at school or when I am wherever I am in the States, which is, what do they think of us and what do they say about us? It's the same exact question and literally the same words as well. I think if anything that means that there is obviously mutual curiosity on both sides of the spectrum, if you want to say, and that usually the way I understood it when I growing up is that the Arab world and the Muslim world has a fascination and has a lot of respect actually for one American in particular way of living, and in general in the West we tend to see it as organized. It's less corrupt than ours actually, and we see it to be more efficient, things that we actually want to have in our societies. That is, I don't believe that kind of message gets the chance to get across to people here as much. What you see is obviously what you see on television. And very quick story: a friend of mine in Mexico, very religious Jewish friend of mine, called the lady and said, "I have this Palestinian guy that I want to meet." And she said, "There's no way on earth I'm going to meet a terrorist and let him, first of all, not only meet him, and also let him come into my house." Finally, he convinced her. He said, "No, he's not very scary. He doesn't have a beard. He's not carrying anything on him. I promise. I've already checked him." So I walked into the house, and the first thing I could see is the lady who I met was sitting, as far from me as possible because she didn't know what to expect. After 2 hours of conversation, she said, "This is your house." She was hugging me and saying, "This is your house. You can come back whenever you want." The image I've had of Arabs and of Muslims, of Palestinians, is that of someone who's always with a gun and shouting on CNN and saying death to these people or death to those kind of people. So it's just an example of showing how it actually works, that you as a person have a responsibility of relaying a message to other people around you. So.
Thank you. I think the question about the neighbors, what do
you do personally to understand the other?
Well, I mean, basically the nice thing about being neighbors is that you get to know one another based on, in terms of what goes on in your everyday lives, oh, the neighbor planted tulips. Oh my God, they look nice. Maybe I should get some. I should go ask her a few questions. And the commonalities that you forge with your neighbors have nothing to do about have little to do with your religious identity or what you practice or what you eat or where you observe. So that's the nice thing. And if you can accomplish that with your neighbors, just to know each other as humans, I think that's a great accomplishment. And that's at least what I strive for with my neighbors. Where, I feel comfortable with my children visiting their homes, they feel comfortable with their children visiting my home. That is indeed a true model to want to emulate. In terms of what I wish or I hope that this audience takes with them, I suppose if I may say this, I mean, what would be really, I guess, my dream come true, or what I hope that we accomplish this evening, is that my understanding about faith in general is that most of us are born into the faith we embrace. Small minorities convert to a certain faith. So I suppose the question is, if you grew up in the Muslim faith, how would you be responding to the current dilemma facing Muslims in this country and facing Muslims across the world? What would you be doing differently? And if you have ideas or suggestions, we'd love to hear them as well.
I think I would just like to say, in terms of neighbors, I'm a workaholic, so I never even see my own apartment. So, but in terms of what I do, reach out to other people, I think finding the commonalities as just a human being in terms of what school do you go to, what do you do in your life, what do you like, what kind of movies do you watch. I think in that conversation, faith or how I practice it or how I live my personal life has very little to do with that, as long as you have a friendship based on trust and mutual respect. In terms of what I hope that the audience could take back from here is, don't believe everything you hear about us. Because not most of us are like the way we are presented in Fox News, especially. And secondly, if we can come out with a solution of trying not to honor people in the West, and this is my biggest problem, who are not doing a service either to Islam or to the Western countries or the Western civilization. I think if that could be taken into account and if that message could be passed on, that would be my hope and my dream that this audience could take back. Thank you.
I think I actually first met Daanish about 2 years ago when I was at his office with the founder of his organization, Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, who I think is one of the great Muslim leaders in America. And I'd gotten an advance copy of Imam Faisal's book, and he signed it, and he blessed me, and I was very excited. And I went and I got on my plane, and I found myself on the tarmac at LaGuardia for about 3 hours, typical challenge going into O'Hare, and the woman sitting next to me was reading a book called Just Give Me Jesus. And I thought to myself, people actually look at you with similar suspicion as they look at me. I mean, I was reading What's Right with Islam, and she's reading Just Give Me Jesus. I'm like, this whole plane is tripping out, right? What are these two going to do? You know, and I thought, you know what? I am not going to lead an interfaith organization and carry around a set of stereotypes about evangelicals without talking to this one. And so we talked, and we exchanged books, and we showed each other our favorite paragraphs of the books we were reading. And I thought to myself, you know, there are a lot of people in the world who are very skilled at pointing out how other people cannot come together. You know, why Muslims and Jews or Muslims and Christians or Buddhists and Baha'is are somehow inevitably opposed to one another, right? I mean, it's a set of skills to learn how to polarize people. And I guess I'm interested in a different set of skills. I'm interested in the set of skills and the set of and the knowledge base and the type of eyes that figure out points in common, even between the most unlikely pairs. right? So it took us like 90 minutes to kind of build a little bit of a rapport with each other. But I was absolutely convinced that, if there was 1 centimeter of common ground in a 100-mile area, I'm going to find it and I'm going to stand on it with this woman, right? And I don't care if she thinks we're going to different places in the afterlife, because, right now we're on this plane together. And kind of what matters to me the most about her is Earth, not the afterlife. And I feel like that's what America is about. America is about a lot of people with different backgrounds and different beliefs and different ideas of heaven who are trying to make this piece of Earth go well. And I just, I want to take that way of being, which again I think is within all of us. We all naturally incline towards that. I just want to make sure that part of who we are as human has at least a chance to come out.
Generally, when I'm asked these questions, I don't like being preachy at all. And I'll just tell you what I tell myself. Which is that I believe very much in trying to look at people as much as possible as human, as very complicated, as a mixture or an aggregate of very different experiences, and as prone to error as much as I am. And I try to really take that to heart and adopt it in terms of, trying to be as universalist and as accepting of different people as possible. See, in my view of religion is that part of religion's purpose, or a large part of its purpose, is to organize people in their coexistence, in their lives, in the time they spend in this world. And when I can't internalize something that undermines that undermines coexistence, that undermines pluralism, that undermines tolerance. Because that just doesn't work. I mean, that's not, according to my own opinion, that's not what religion is meant to do. It's supposed to promote that. And in terms of my personal religion, that's what I try to adopt. In terms of what I want you guys to take back, the little that I want you to take back is that you begin to see the nuance. You begin to really think about the nuance that you've seen here today in terms of the panel, the kind of, there's so many of us and we're all so different, and we all, the way we think, the way we consider these issues, that we're human, of course, just like you, but there's so many gradations of what it means to be Muslim. There's so many Muslim identities. And that when you look at global issues, when you think about, all the conflicts that are taking place, you explore further. You don't just accept what's presented to you. In terms of domestically or internally within the American context, I would very much hope that all of you after this try to develop relationships with other Muslims, try to develop these kind of human connections with other Muslims. And there's so many different frameworks that you can use to develop dialogue or to develop these relationships. One thing that I mentioned during my remarks is the idea of being a minority. We're both minorities and we have so much in common in our histories as people in this country. And we do have a shared culture. I mean, I speak a little Hebrew, and it's very, very similar to Arabic. And of course there's what everyone talks about, the cliche, Spain, southern Spain. So there's so much that we can build kind of these connections and these human relationships on, and I think that's the key.
There's always falafel.
On that note, I think we're all ready for some falafel. I want to thank our panelists for being so honest and for inspiring us and for being emotional with us and open. And thank all of you for coming tonight. We really appreciate that you spent this time with us and hope that you found it interesting and that you will grow from this experience to other ones like it and help create your own. Thank you very much.
On tomorrow's Washington Journal, NPR correspondent Tom Bowman on military operations